By the way, can you hear me okay? Yeah. Wonderful, wonderful. Just out of curiosity, does anybody want to take a guess at what these are? Anybody know? Or if you had to guess, what's that?
Temperature.
Temperature. Oh, in some sense, that's not too far off. Anybody else? Yeah. Yeah, that's right. That's right. Specifically, whose neural network, though? These represent humans, right? Which is kind of funny. In particular, this came from an MIT study a couple months ago where they essentially gave people a creative writing task. And they divided people up into 3 cohorts. So there's a pencil and paper cohort, there's the Google search cohort, and then there's the LLM cohort. And if you had to guess, by the way, just maybe looking at the pictures, any idea who the pencil and paper people are? What's that? On the right? Why is that? Yeah, why is that? Why do you think? Yeah. Right, it's amazing, it's amazing. So you can see all this fantastic sort of activation where, these people, they're struggling with, let's say, the existential crisis of the blank page, and they're doing like sort of wonderful sort of generation and synthesis. And probably this neurogenesis is happening, but I think at least historically, this is where people typically used to put in their 10,000 hours, right? If you look at that activation, that's sort of the path to mastery. That's where you're actually creating memories and that sort of thing. So if the right people are the pencil and paper, who are the Google search people? The middle folks, yeah, exactly. And it's kind of weird, right? They're almost the inversion of the pencil and paper folks. And it turns out that the Google people are engaging in primarily like synthetic activity, in the sense that they're taking a look at the 10 blue links, they're trying to figure out what's going on, and eventually they're writing the essay. And overall, I think possibly, neurologically cooler. And then so by process of elimination, who are the LLM folks? Well, that's awful. So what's funny about the LLM folks is that neurologically speaking, essentially, you're looking at inertia, right? And to a certain extent, by offloading, let's say, the creative activity, the generative or the synthetic activity to the LLM, essentially they can go grab a coffee and come back in a few minutes. And what you're looking at neurologically, at least, is kind of possibly a lack of engagement, a lack of memory generation. And so the question I had was, what are the long-term effects of that kind of mental inertia, right? And I think the bad news is that we're probably all going to find out. I think whether we like it or not, we've been enrolled in this experiment. But the good news is we get to pay for the privilege, right? So anyway, this is going to be sort of, in terms of the future of AI, actually, I think in some sense, this to me is the most pressing question. And this is a little more esoteric, but this is just from the same study. And these are so-called, anybody seen these before or whatever? They're a little bit, anyway, they're just these so-called cosine similarity matrices. And so what this is measuring is essentially to what extent these essays that were generated by people are similar to one another. And so if you look at the left, that's the LLM people, you get this ripple effect, which implies that the essays generated by the LLM people had very little diversity. And essentially they were sort of more or less kind of identical to one another. And then on the right-hand side with the pencil and paper people, you just have these wonderful pockets of kind of diversity and divergence. But anyway, so I was thinking about this a little bit, and it just so happened that a couple weeks ago, I was rereading Aristotle's Rhetoric, and I came across this really interesting dichotomy. This was actually new to me. Has anybody heard of these? Has anybody heard of poietic versus parastic? This is new to me. What is it? Does anybody know these words? Okay, so I'm not the only one. So the funny thing is so Aristotle talks about the art of poietike, or this poetic art, as primarily just the art of making things. And so for Aristotle, the poetic art par excellence was rhetoric, where you're just essentially, you're producing words. And to a certain extent, LLMs, at least currently, I feel like are fundamentally poetic, right? They generate these strange artifacts and texts and images and movies. And, I think recently Google did this thing where, the LLMs are now generating math and maybe potentially physics at some point. But they're fundamentally poetic. They put these artifacts in front of you. And if you're lucky, maybe you get a little follow-on question about whether you want to know more about sort of X, Y, Z. But Aristotle contrasts that with this thing he calls the parastic, or the perastike. And the interesting thing about the parastic, it's the art of testing and being tested. And in Aristotle's view, this was dialectic kind of par excellence. And in particular, in Socrates and the Theaetetus, he talks about this weird process of becoming a midwife of ideas, where when you get together with Socrates, he sort of labors with you in some sense to give birth to your ideas. And Plato in the Seventh Letter talks about this sort of enkindling of the soul that happens after sort of a lifetime of engaging with your dialectic, your parastic partner. But I think what happens during that struggle is that the ideas that are created through that sort of process of labor tend to be the most salient and the most memorable. And so the question I had was, let's say Socrates, or LLMs for that matter, let's say they unburden us from the labor of producing ideas. And what are some of the potential outcomes of that? And I think it's possible, we'll sort of jury's out, but it's possible that there's sort of a twofold tragedy, is that namely, if you're unburdened from this process of actually laboring to give birth to your ideas, it's possible that the ideas don't happen in the first place. And second of all, and this is much worse, that maybe you never become the sort of person who gives birth to ideas, right? And so the question I had was, can LLMs be parastic companions? Can they actually sort of help us give birth to ideas? And unfortunately, I think, at least given the state of the art, I think the answer is by default no. My sense is, in Google and Anthropic, we've tried to do a couple of things. So Google has this thing called Learn LM, which is, I think it's something for students, and Anthropic has this learning mode. But as far as I can tell, they're fundamentally sort of poietic models with a little bit of parastic garnish. And my intuition is that in order to create these models that truly sort of challenge people and maybe push us out of our comfort zones to new forms of competence, I don't know if we can trivially sort of prompt engineer our way out of these things. It could be that we need these kind of foundational models. But to me, I guess when I think about the future of AI and ethics, for some reason, this seems to me actually one of the more pressing issues. And Microsoft came out with a study a few months ago where it found that engineers who over-rely on these LLM-assisted tools tend to give up their sort of faculty of their critical faculties. They outsource their critical faculties to the LLMs, and they become these mini Roman emperors who are sort of doing like thumbs up and thumbs down, these sort of verifiers of information. And so in some sense, they've ceded their kind of active critical faculty to the LLM, and they become this passive verifier of information. And but Microsoft had this really interesting conclusion with the paper, where they said that as tool makers, somehow the burden is on us actually to create tools that challenge our users. So in some sense, we shouldn't be just furnishing them with these sort of easy answers. We should actually be sort of making sure that engineers who use these tools are actually sort of competent or growing in competence. And so I found that kind of interesting, and I thought that, maybe the future of AI, maybe it requires, to make sure that we continue on this kind of hockey stick trajectory and we don't fall into this kind of collective mental inertia. I wonder if we need two things. I wonder if, as tool makers, we have a responsibility to develop these parastic tools that actually challenge people. But number two is I wonder if, as users, we actually need to demand that our models sort of challenge us. And in some sense, basically, it's a little bit tough because, I don't know, every time I'm using ChatGPT or Gemini, for instance, the things they're so sycophantic, right? And I can't, even if I tell it, listen, like, please just stop agreeing with me, right? It just doesn't really stick. Anyway, so I think my sense is if we want to ensure that there's this sort of interesting and bright future of AI, if we want to make sure there's this productive co-evolution with these models, I think we have to figure out how to develop this parastic relationship to the things. And with that, by the way, I just thought I'd kind of take some questions, just in case anybody has anything interesting to ask about LLMs or, yeah.
How widespread do you think?
Yeah.
Keith Deere. My question was, how widespread do you think the desire for a parastic relationship with LLMs is, as opposed to like ramping up the sycophancy to increase user engagement?
probably zero or even negative, right? And so I think, part of the sycophancy is it creates this dopamine cycle where you keep coming back because, frankly, it feels good to be told that you're a genius and that you're doing great. And so I think that's the challenge, right? It could be that if you have this LLM, which sort of puts you out of your comfort zone, maybe you actually never end up coming back. Maybe, in fact, I would never end up coming back. So no, I think that's a really difficult problem. And, OpenAI, I think they published this, there was some sort of article which came out a couple of weeks ago where they mentioned they were actually they were turning down the sycophancy value, maybe from like 11 to 10 or whatever, right? And because I think they noticed this interesting thing where in extreme cases, things like, I don't know, schizophrenic fantasies, but, maybe less extreme, maybe just conspiracy theories, all of these things are being sort of corroborated by the model. And I think in certain cases, maybe that leads to a sort of vicious cycle, right, psychologically. No, that's a great question, actually, and I don't have a great answer for that. Yeah, sorry. Okay, sorry.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Hello?
Oh,
Is
yeah.
that working?
Yeah. Oh, is it working now? Oh, Joe, is it?
Maybe,
Oh,
yeah.
there it goes. Perfect.
I want to clarify whether I understand what you're saying, really.
Yeah.
Because earlier this week, I looked at a piece of my son's schoolwork, and it was evident to me that he used a language model to do it from just reading through it. So I looked up that paper that you just put up from Stanford.
Oh, yeah.
And explained that to him by doing a summary with ChatGPT, of course. And what struck me was that something I'd never realised before, which is the time that I spent at school, which I thought was about learning knowledge and learning techniques and passing exams and stuff like that, was actually about developing my brain as well, in terms of neuroplasticity and things like that, which I'd never realised before, although I'm nearly 60. And the thing that I was worried about, really, was this generation of kids like my son who are beginning to use these tools, whether it's actually going to stunt, not only make them less inclined to have ideas, but less able, because it's going to stunt their brain development. Right. And I wondered if that's what you were saying, essentially.
That's exactly right. And, in some sense, and that's what I was saying in this, like in the Theaetetus example, let's say this generation of children, they're no longer in a position to give birth to ideas. In some sense, that's the biggest tragedy. And, there's a funny thing in Silicon Valley sometimes where we don't necessarily let our children use our own products, right? So oh, and by the way, by the way, Tim, do you mind giving them the mic just in case? I was just going to say, and this is sort of interesting because I've sort of been observing how other Silicon Valley parents behave with this sort of thing. And previously it was, listen, if you had a lot of cash, you sent your kids to the best schools and you didn't give them laptops until they were 13 or 15 or whatever. And I've really been thinking through this problem. This problem of the 10,000 hours lately is what I've been sort of thinking through. And like you mentioned, I think 10,000 hours, you could view it as mastery of a certain subject, but I think you're right. There's these other almost secondary effects of like neuroplasticity that just, if you master anything, it's somehow better than mastering nothing. And I'm wondering whether, and I don't know if it's even possible to do this, whether you should put in your 10,000 hours before you even touch these tools, whether the 10K is sort of a rite of passage in some sense. Practically speaking, though, I'm not sure how to pull that off. Because I don't know how it is at your son's school, but at work, for instance, they've determined that, let's say, engineers are maybe 20 to 30% more effective with these things. And so what they've done is they've sort of turned up the speed on the treadmill a little bit, such that you're just expected to produce 20 to 30% more. And so and I've heard the same thing from lawyers and whatever. And so in some sense, you're dependent on these tools now just for sheer velocity. And I don't know if it's the same thing in school, whether in some sense there's a dependency on these things. And there's another interesting thing I read the other week, which was that, we have these tools that they're not great, but they're reasonably good at sort of sniffing out some of these LLM signatures. And, and I've heard that in certain colleges now, they've actually stopped using these things because they're afraid of actually losing tuition, right? And, so in some sense, they've turned a blind eye to this thing. But I think the downside is that, like you said, worst case scenario, it somehow stunts their growth. That's really, I guess that's my main, yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah.
That's essentially what I was worrying about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Hi, my name is Linda, and I'm a PhD here. I build AI for supporting older consumers using digital tech and making platforms more accessible. And I think
wonderful.
my question sort of builds on everything that you asked as well, sort of the balance between augmentation and automation. Because obviously, if we are supporting, for instance, developers in making their platforms more accessible and helping them with essentially automating the entire process of auditing their code, we are doing it for them, so it's not necessarily parastic. But at the same time, we want to create guardrails that can actually support developers in doing this. And I think this is just a microcosm for the larger issue with tech innovation, is that it makes things so convenient that it can also support us in becoming very lazy intellectually, which is really scary. Because, yeah, I converse with ChatGPT a lot, and it's really sycophantic. But it can also be really helpful sometimes as like an advisor.
It's true. But I guess here's the thing that I'm trying to figure out. And actually, I was giving a talk, I think, at Sussex on Tuesday. And somebody mentioned something kind of interesting. I don't know if this is a little bit controversial, but anyway, there was this whole Trump tariff business, right? And somebody found out that, maybe they were using LLMs to generate these tariff bans. And I think there were a couple countries where maybe the OCR screwed up. And anyway, the LLM somehow determined that, I don't know, one of these countries should have been tariffed to like 90% when it was anyway, it was 15. But this guy mentioned something kind of funny, which is he said, listen, if you just had an economist in the room, could literally just glance at the numbers and say, oh my God, that's totally off. Like, there's no way this should have happened. But I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, for these, let's say these LLM augmented tools and that sort of thing, like right now, like let's say for the sake of argument, you've become a competent programmer and you've put in the time and you have this intuition. And when the LLM does something obviously wrong, you can just kind of see it. In some sense, when I'm looking at the code, I don't even really have to read it. For some reason, I can even just tell by the shape of the code that something is like weird, right? Even before I said it. But in some sense, that intuition, it's like I've developed that over these, like, let's say, hours of just work or whatever. And I guess the question is, in order to make use of these augmented tools, not these automated tools, do you need to come in with a certain amount of competence, a certain amount of like intuition already? And if you start with these augmented tools, do you even have an opportunity to develop that intuition? Like in the first place, I don't, I guess that's what I'm trying to figure out.
Yeah, sorry, I have one follow-up. So, because I see a lot of like AI and LLM classes that people are giving to make it easier to use, and I know I see it on LinkedIn. They're like, "Oh, I'll teach you how to use AI."
Yeah.
But I just feel like if kids are coming in, because I grew up in, like I'm young, but I grew up having to write essays on my own, and I think it really, like you said, neuroplasticity, it really trained my ability to think and to argue and to debate, which is really the entire point of a degree, right? It's supposed to train you to think, and then kids today are growing up with LLMs. And if I was a child, I would also be just pure velocity. It's just easier to write an essay with ChatGPT, but you don't get challenged in the same way. And I think like coming as an adult and using it, it's much easier for me to, I can tell when it's bullshitting, but I don't think someone in middle school or high school can.
In some sense, you develop that intuition. Let me ask you something though. Like, is it possible that, one thing I've noticed since, let's say the rise of Cursor and a bunch of these things is that like in GitHub now, there are these repositories that exist just because people have like figured out these quote unquote optimal prompts for like, prompting Cursor, let's say, to create the best code. And for the sake of argument, let's say they've hit on these strange magical incantations. And let's also say for the sake of argument that these magical incantations are slightly different across models. So maybe the way you'd prompt Claude versus GPT versus Gemini, maybe the magical incantations are slightly different. But I guess the question is, does that constitute a new form of literacy, like being able to interact with these models in a quote unquote optimal way? Like is that something equivalent to being able to write sort of beautiful or efficient code or something? Or do you think it's slightly different?
I think what's interesting is that I've had a lot of conversations about this with my friends, and we talk about how LLMs are liberating people to truly focus on creativity and joy and like frolicking in the grass, because it does like the admin, which I think is an optimistic way to look at tech, is like, it can do all the sort of really grainy work that you don't want to do so that you can be creative. So in the age of AI, the barrier to entry is lower. People can do really basic coding. And so your challenge is making a product that is actually really unique because everyone can do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but no one can go up to 10. So I think that's like the optimistic view is that.
Yeah, yeah. And by the way, how plausible do you think that is? Because there is a funny thing where we're still doing taxes, and then LLMs are making math, music, and poetry, right? There's a sense in which somehow it's been inverted.
It's flipped.
No, you're right. That's the optimistic view. That would be wonderful, actually. And typically when I talk about any of this stuff, so at Google I run this Jim and I meet up every couple of weeks, and sometimes when I talk about these issues, people bring up like the calculator, and somehow the calculator didn't really enslave us. The calculator didn't really mess with our neuroplasticity. We learned how to divide, and then the calculator liberated us to do like calculus or higher order math. And so they sort of cite the calculator as evidence that LLMs are also going to liberate us to think about higher order things. And I guess the question is, how plausible do you think? Do you think that's plausible, or like what's your sense?
I don't really see technology as like good or bad inherently. I think the way that we shape it is what will determine what it does to us. And so I guess like my perspective is that if we use it in a way that is balanced and that actually is geared towards challenging our thinking, then it will have a possibility to support us in becoming sort of not intellectually, but more intellectually dynamic people. But with the way that it is right now, because it's an open field, it's like the Wild West. And obviously regulation cannot catch up with the way that it's developing.
And here's another thing I'm trying to figure out. Do we have any responsibility to make that happen? Like, I mean, one of the things is that I think humans are inherently efficient in the sense that, like, let's say we haven't spoken a language in 10 years, the brain just decides more or less to like prune the neural pathways or whatever if we haven't been doing things for a while. And there's a sense in which the human is sort of this efficient machine in the sense that it prunes these unnecessary things. And I guess what I'm trying to figure out is, like, left to our own devices, like, will we just sort of get lazy and will we fall into the left-hand side of the brain scans? Or in other words, do we have some responsibility to make sure that happens, that sort of we actually get uplift, that there's a virtuous coevolution with these? Yeah.